When Ethan entered my office and locked the door, an almost palpable tension gripped the room. My heart raced at the same moment, pounding in my chest. He approached me slowly, his seductive gaze fixed on me, and I felt a warmth spread through my body. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and husky. Before I could reply, I felt his firm hands touch my waist, gently pulling me closer to him. It was as if an electric current passed between us, a magnetism that was impossible to ignore. His every touch made my body react in a way I had never experienced before. I looked into his eyes, trying to find an explanation for what we were doing. How did I get to this point? Cheating on Michael, my husband. The question echoed in my mind, but the answer seemed to slip away with every passing second. "This is wrong, Ethan," I murmured, my voice trembling, trying to fight the overwhelming wave of desire that was growing inside me. He didn't reply with words. Instead, he leaned in close, his face just centimeters from mine. I felt his hot breath, the closeness setting my last defenses on fire. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his eyes burning with intensity. Those words were my undoing. I knew I should walk away, that I should be strong and faithful to Michael. But there, in that small office, with Ethan so close, all I could think about was how much I wanted to lose myself in that moment. "I think about you too," I admitted, my voice almost a whisper. And then, without further hesitation, our lips met in a forbidden kiss. The sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of guilt and pleasure that consumed me completely. Ethan pulled me even closer, and I couldn't resist. Between sighs and caresses, reality dissolved, leaving only desire and tension in the air. The day Ethan started working at the company in Seattle is still fresh in my memory. I was in a meeting when he entered the room for the first time. His intense blue eyes captured my attention instantly. I felt a chill in my stomach and knew that something was about to change. Even though I knew I was married to Michael, I couldn't help the attraction I felt at that moment. That morning, after the meeting, I saw him in the pantry, preparing a cup of coffee. I decided to introduce myself after all. He was my new co-worker, and it would be polite of me to welcome him. "Hi, you must be Ethan. I'm Laura," I said, holding out my hand. "Yes, it's me. Nice to meet you, Laura," he replied, shaking my hand firmly. His touch made my heart race a little faster. I ended up staying there for longer than necessary. We chatted about trivia, about the company, but soon the conversation turned to more personal matters. I discovered that we had many interests in common, from books to movies and music. It was as if we had known each other all our lives. During our conversation, he made me laugh several times, something I hadn't done so often lately. "You have a great sense of humor, Ethan," I said, still laughing at one of his jokes. "And you have a lovely smile, Laura," he replied, and I felt my face blush at the compliment. That day, I left the office with a strange feeling of happiness and guilt. I knew I shouldn't feel this way about another man, but I couldn't help it. A few days later, Ethan invited me out for coffee. I accepted without much thought, as if something inside me wanted to explore this new sensation. We spent hours chatting in a cozy coffee shop, laughing and exchanging meaningful glances. It felt like the world around us had disappeared, and there was just the two of us. "Laura, you're incredible. I've never met someone I connected with so quickly," Ethan said, looking into my eyes. "I feel the same way, Ethan. It's strange, but at the same time, it feels so right," I replied, knowing I was entering dangerous territory. When I got home that evening, Michael was in the living room, watching TV. He looked at me and smiled, but I couldn't help the weight of guilt that fell on me. Despite this, I couldn't get Ethan out of my head. The attraction I felt for him was undeniable, And even though I knew I was playing with fire, I couldn't stop. The next few days in the office were delicious torture. Every time our gazes met, I felt an electric current run through my body. I knew I was getting too involved, but desire was stronger than reason. And so I sank deeper and deeper into my attraction to Ethan, even though I knew I was betraying Michael's trust. I kept asking myself how I had gotten to this point, but the answers seemed to slip through my fingers. Topic 3. The project we were developing was crucial for the company, and this forced us to spend long hours in the office. Ethan and I worked side by side, concentrated, but the closeness between us was undeniable. His every move, every word spoken in that deep voice, made me uneasy. I tried to focus on the spreadsheets and graphs, but it was impossible to ignore his presence. One evening, while we were going over some documents, he leaned over the table to show me something on the computer. Our arms touched accidentally, and a shiver ran through my body. The electricity of that contact was like a spark that ignited something inside me. I looked at him, and our gazes met. There was an intensity that I had never felt before. "Sorry," he mumbled, but the smile at the corner of his lips said otherwise. I just shook my head, trying to look indifferent, but my heart was racing. That same evening, as we discussed the latest changes to the project in the conference room, I felt the tension between us grow even more. He was so close that I could feel his warmth. Suddenly, without warning, Ethan grabbed my hand. It was a light touch, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my whole body react. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and husky. I couldn't answer. I was paralyzed, torn between desire and guilt. Before I could think of anything, he moved even closer and kissed me. It was a forbidden kiss, but charged with a passion I couldn't control. My senses were overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. His taste, his touch, the feeling of doing something so wrong and yet so irresistible. When we broke apart, panting, I looked at him, still trying to process what had just happened. "This can't happen again," I said, more to myself than to him. He just smiled, that smile that made my heart skip a beat. "But it will happen," he said with a confidence that completely disarmed me. I left the conference room with my heart in my mouth, knowing that I had crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed. The betrayal of Michael weighed heavily on my conscience, but the attraction to Ethan was something I could no longer ignore. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The text messages between Ethan and me became more and more provocative. At first, they were just subtle comments about work, but soon they evolved into something more personal, more intimate. I found myself smiling at the cell phone screen, eagerly awaiting the next message. His words had a power over me that I couldn't explain, a mixture of charm and temptation that left me breathless. Evenings at home with Michael began to change. Before, I used to lay my head on the pillow and fall asleep quickly, but now I lay awake, lost in thoughts of Ethan. Erotic dreams about him were recurring, and when I woke up, I felt a mixture of shame and excitement. I would look at Michael sleeping next to me, his breathing calm, and guilt would consume me. How could I do this to him? He was a good man, always loving and attentive. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. That particular evening, Michael asked me if I was okay. I was distracted, lost in my thoughts. I replied with a forced smile and said I was just tired from work. He believed me, of course. He always did. But the guilt continued to eat me up inside. That's when I made my first excuse about working late. "We have an urgent project," I lied to Michael. "I need to stay in the office until later to finalize some details." He looked at me with understanding and said he understood. The guilt grew, but the excitement of seeing Ethan soon overcame any feelings of remorse. I arrived at the office after hours. The building was almost empty, just a few lights on here and there. My heart was racing as I took the elevator up. When the doors opened, there he was, waiting for me with that seductive smile that made my whole body shiver. "Hi," said Ethan, his voice low and husky. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my composure. He came closer and, without saying a word, pulled me into a tight hug. I felt his warm body against mine, and for a moment, all my thoughts disappeared. It was just him and me in that empty office, lost in a world of our own. "You looked beautiful today," he whispered in my ear. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." "Me too," I admitted, my voice breaking. Ethan released me and looked deep into my eyes. "Let's go to the conference room," he said, taking my hand. We walked in silence, the tension between us almost palpable. When we reached the conference room, he closed the door behind us and, before I could say anything, he kissed me. The kiss was intense, full of pent-up desire. His hands explored my body, and I gave myself completely to that moment. The text messages, the dreams, the guilt. All of that seemed distant now. I was lost in a whirlwind of emotions, torn between the remorse of betraying Michael and the overwhelming passion I felt for Ethan. "I can't go on with this," I said, panting when we finally broke apart. "You don't have to decide anything now," Ethan replied, stroking my cheek. "Let's just enjoy the moment." I knew he was right, but the guilt continued to eat away at me. How had I gotten to this point? How had I let things go so far? I had no answers, just a divided heart and a mind full of doubts. As we went back to our business, I couldn't stop thinking about the future. Part of me wanted to put a stop to it, go back to Michael and try to repair the damage. But another part, a darker, passion-hungry part, wanted to continue with Ethan, to explore that forbidden desire more and more. The text messages continued, more and more provocative. I found myself anxiously awaiting the next meeting. But every night, as I lay next to Michael, guilt plagued me. I knew that sooner or later I would have to make a choice. But for now, I was trapped in a cycle of desire and regret, unable to decide between safe love and forbidden passion. That evening, I decided to meet Ethan in a discreet bar in the city center. I was nervous. My hands were sweating, and my heart was beating faster with every step I took towards the agreed location. When I saw him sitting in the darkest corner of the bar, I felt a mixture of relief and excitement. He was there, waiting for me, and the sexual tension between us was almost palpable. "You came," he said, getting up to greet me with a smile that made my heart race even more. "Of course I came," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. We needed to talk. We sat down and ordered 2 glasses of wine. The atmosphere was perfect for a secret meeting. Dim lights, soft music, and few people. With every sip of wine, I felt courage growing inside me, but also a guilt that insisted on reminding me of Michael, my husband, who was at home, oblivious to what was going on. "So what do you want to do?" I asked, my voice coming out firmer than I expected. Ethan looked at me with those piercing eyes and said, "Let's get out of here." Without much thought, I agreed. We left the bar, and he drove me to a nearby motel. The drive there was a blur of anxiety and desire. As soon as we entered the room, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. He pulled me close, and our lips met with an urgency I had never felt before. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured between kisses. "Me too," I confessed, feeling a wave of heat run through my body. That first night of passion with Ethan was overwhelming. Every touch, every kiss, every whisper seemed to set my skin on fire. I was completely surrendered, letting go of all guilt and fear. For a few hours, the outside world didn't exist, just the two of us and the intensity of our desire. in that bed, entwined. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. "I want you so much," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "I want you too, Ethan," I replied, my voice lacerated with emotion. After hours of passion, we fell exhausted onto the bed. I knew that night would change everything, but at that moment, I couldn't worry about the consequences. Ethan held me tightly, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that it could last forever. When I finally fell asleep in his arms, guilt tried to creep in, but I pushed it away, wanting to prolong that moment of ecstasy. I knew that the next morning would bring reality back. But for now, I let myself be consumed by the fire that Ethan and I had lit. The next morning, I woke up with a mixture of remorse and excitement. The sun was streaming in through the gaps in the motel curtains, bathing the room in a soft light. Ethan was still asleep next to me, his breathing slow and deep as I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. Michael must have been wondering where I was. My cell phone, forgotten at the bottom of my bag, contained unread messages from him. I got up slowly, trying not to wake Ethan. I walked to the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My face had an expression I didn't fully recognize, a mixture of guilt and satiated desire. I washed my face in an attempt to clear my thoughts. Back in the bedroom, I quickly got dressed. Ethan began to stir, his eyes slowly opening. "Good morning," he said with a lazy smile. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have to go." He sat up in bed, still drowsy. "I see. See you in the office?" I nodded, knowing that the real challenge would begin there. How could I keep my composure after the night before? Every time I thought of Michael, I felt a pang of guilt. But at the same time, the memory of Ethan's touch made me shiver with excitement. In the office, I tried to concentrate on my work, but my mind wandered. Ethan entered the conference room for a meeting, and our gazes met briefly. My skin crawled, and a familiar warmth surged through my body. During the meeting, bold fantasies crept into my thoughts, making it even harder to concentrate. During the break, Ethan approached me in the office's small kitchen. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, as he prepared a cup of coffee. "Yeah, just trying to stay focused," I replied, grabbing a cup for myself too. "I'm having trouble too," he said, with a half smile. "But it's a kind of difficulty I don't mind facing." I laughed nervously, and he took a step closer to me, close enough for me to feel his warmth. "We need to be careful," I whispered, looking around to see if anyone was watching us. "I know," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "But that just makes it all the more exciting, don't you think?" I nodded, unable to deny it. There was something intoxicating about taking risks, about feeling the danger lurking. Every time Ethan walked past me, every accidental touch made my heart race. In the evening, at home, Michael noticed my distraction. "Are you all right?" he asked worriedly. "Yeah, just tired from work," I lied, forcing a smile. "I'm going to take a shower and go to bed." In the shower, the hot water helped ease the tension, but thoughts of Ethan didn't go away. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. The excitement, the adrenaline, it was all addictive. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Ethan. "Good morning. I can't wait to see you today." I felt a chill in my stomach, and an involuntary smile appeared on my lips. In the office, every meeting became a new opportunity for fantasy. Ethan and I exchanged furtive glances, teasing messages and complicit smiles. It was hard to resist. One afternoon, during a particularly tedious meeting, my mind began to wander. I imagined Ethan pulling me into a secluded corner of the office, his lips on mine, his hands exploring my body. The fantasy was so vivid that I could almost feel his touch. When the meeting was over, Ethan approached me. "You were away, weren't you?" he asked, with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Yes, I was," I admitted, blushing slightly. "I wonder where your mind was," he teased. "Maybe one day I'll tell you," I replied, trying to keep my composure. The days became a constant struggle between maintaining a facade of normality and giving in to the temptations that Ethan represented. Every time we met, the desire to take risks only increased. And despite the constant guilt, there was a part of me that loved every moment of danger, every forbidden touch, every stolen kiss. Discovering the pleasure in taking risks was something I had never experienced before, and it consumed me in a way I could never have imagined. I was sitting in my office, trying to concentrate on my work, when the phone rang. It was Ethan. He suggested something that took my breath away. A weekend away from Seattle, just the two of us. My heart raced at the idea, but reality quickly hit me. How would I explain it to Michael? "A work conference," Ethan suggested, his voice soft and persuasive on the other end of the line. "Tell him you need to go to a work conference." The idea seemed crazy, but at the same time irresistible. I agreed with a whisper and hung up, already feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I got home that evening, Michael was sitting on the sofa, reading a book. I sat down next to him, trying not to look nervous. "Michael, I need to tell you something," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have to travel this weekend for a work conference." He looked at me, surprised but not suspicious. "A conference? Just like that? At the last minute?" he asked, frowning. "Yes, it came up suddenly. It's very important for the project I'm working on," I lied, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. He nodded slowly and turned his attention back to the book. "All right, love. Just don't work too hard, okay?" he said with a fond smile. That night, as Michael slept next to me, guilt began to consume me. But at the same time, the excitement of what was to come kept me awake. On Friday, I left work straight for the airport, where Ethan was already waiting for me. His eyes shone with anticipation and desire when he saw me. We got on the plane and left for a distant city where no one knew us. We arrived at the hotel and couldn't wait to get into the room. As soon as the door closed, Ethan pulled me into his arms, and our lips met in a voracious kiss. The passion between us was uncontrollable, and we soon found ourselves in bed, overcome with desire. "I've wanted this for so long," Ethan whispered, as his hands explored my body. "Me too," I replied, panting, as I felt a wave of pleasure wash over me. We spent the weekend immersed in unbridled passion. Every touch, every kiss, every whisper brought us closer together. But as the weekend drew to a close, the fear of being discovered began to weigh heavily on my mind. "What are we going to do when we get back?" I asked, lying in Ethan's arms. "We'll carry on as we are. No one needs to know," he replied, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. On the flight back, the silence between us was palpable. I knew I was playing with fire, but adrenaline and desire were stronger than any remorse I could feel. When I got home, Michael welcomed me with a warm hug. I smiled, trying to hide the guilt that burned inside me. That night, as he slept next to me, I wondered how long I could keep up this charade. But one thing was certain: I wasn't ready to give up Ethan. The return to routine was more difficult than I had imagined. Every morning at Michael's side felt like an endurance test. I'd get up, fake a smile, and follow the same old routine, but nothing seemed normal. Every meeting with Ethan in the office was a reminder of what we had shared, what we still wanted to share. And worst of all, was the guilt that was eating me up inside. Michael began to notice my change. "Are you all right, love?" he asked one evening while we were having dinner. "You've been distant lately," I'm just tired, I replied, trying to sound convincing. But his eyes showed that he wasn't entirely convinced. I knew he was starting to get suspicious. His questions became more frequent, his glances longer, and his sleepless nights more common. One day, Ethan walked into my office with a serious expression. He closed the door behind him and approached my desk. "We need to talk," he said, with an urgent tone in his voice. "What about?" I asked, already anticipating that it would be a difficult conversation. "I can't go on like this any longer," he replied. "Either you leave, Michael, or we end what we have." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. I knew that this decision would inevitably come, but I wasn't ready to face it. "Ethan, I don't know what to do." My voice trembled. "You need to decide, now," he insisted. "This isn't fair to either of us." Indecision consumed me. On the one hand, there was Michael, the husband who had always supported me, who had been there for me in good times and bad. On the other, Ethan, the overwhelming passion that made me feel alive, desired, like never before. How could I choose between safe love and fiery passion? I spent days trying to avoid Ethan at the office, but he wouldn't give up. "You have to decide," he repeated whenever he managed to find me alone. Every time he said that, my heart raced and my mind went into a whirlwind of emotions. One evening, Michael surprised me in the living room. "Are you hiding something from me?" he asked bluntly. "What do you mean?" I tried to buy time, but my voice was shaking. "You're not the same anymore," he continued. "I can feel it. There's something wrong, and I want to know what it is." Guilt overwhelmed me once again. I wanted to confess everything, to end this anguish, but the words wouldn't come out. "Michael, He came closer and took my hands. "Whatever it is, we can work it out together. I love you, and I want us to be happy." Tears started streaming down my face. I was torn, caught between two worlds that seemed to be colliding more and more. I needed to make a decision, but every option seemed like an endless abyss. Ethan gave me a final ultimatum at the office a few days later. "Decide by the end of the week," he said, with a coldness I had never seen before. "Or I'm out of your life forever." That was the longest week of my life. Every glance from Michael, every encounter with Ethan, felt like a constant reminder of what I was about to lose. And I still didn't know what to do. That Friday, Michael took me by surprise once again. "Shall we go out for dinner tonight?" he suggested, with a hopeful smile. "Sure," I agreed, trying to ignore the pain in my chest. During dinner, he tried to make me laugh, recalling happy times we'd shared. But all I could think about was Ethan's ultimatum, the decision I needed to make. When we got home, Michael pulled me into a tight hug. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together," he whispered. I knew I was on the edge. I needed to make a decision, and I knew that whatever it was, it would have irreversible consequences. I decided to stay with Ethan. It was a risky, and at the same time, exciting choice. I knew I had no plans to leave Michael, but the passion between Ethan and me was something I couldn't ignore. When I told Ethan about my decision, his reaction was unexpected. He didn't look frustrated or disappointed, as I had feared. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race even faster. "So, that's how it's going to be?" Ethan asked, his eyes fixed on mine. "We're going to carry on, even if you're not going to leave, Michael?" I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and tension. "Yes, that's what I want. I can't leave Michael now." He smiled, a smile that was both mischievous and seductive. "So, how about one last date in the office? Just the two of us, no interruptions." Ethan's proposal was bold, and I hesitated for a moment. The idea of meeting in the office, the place where it all began, made me nervous and excited at the same time. I don't know, Ethan. What if someone catches us? He moved closer to me, his hands sliding around my waist. Trust me, it'll be perfect. I wanted to resist, but the temptation was too great. Finally, I gave in, feeling a reluctance that was soon replaced by anticipation. All right, let's do it. That evening, I arrived at the office with my heart racing. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty corridors. When I opened the door, I found Ethan already waiting for me. He was half naked, his eyes shining with desire when he saw me. "You came," he murmured, his voice full of satisfaction. "I told you I'd come," I replied, trying to hide my apprehension. We approached each other slowly, as if each movement were a carefully choreographed dance. "You look beautiful," Ethan whispered, his fingers tracing a slow path down my arm. I felt a shiver run through my body. "Ethan, we don't have much time." He smiled, a smile that promised much more than words could express. "Then let's not waste a second." Before I could reply, he pulled me into a searing kiss, full of desire and urgency. Our bodies merged, and for a moment, the outside world ceased to exist. All that mattered was that moment, that passion that consumed us. Suddenly, we heard the sound of the door opening. We froze, shock and fear spreading through my body. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart beating uncontrollably. Ethan looked at the door, his expression turning serious. "I don't know. Maybe someone came to get something." Panic began to take hold of me. What if it's Michael? What if he's found out everything? Ethan tried to calm me down, his hands holding my shoulders. "Calm down. We'll find out who it is." Carefully, we moved towards the door, trying not to make a sound. When we finally managed to see who was there, I felt relief mixed with a new wave of fear. It was just the night security guard, doing his usual rounds. He didn't see us, and by some miracle, he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. Ethan agreed, his eyes still full of desire, but now also of concern. "Come on, but this isn't the end, understand? We still have a lot to live for." We left the office, each heading in opposite directions. My heart was still racing, but now for different reasons. The adrenaline of the near discovery mixed with the excitement of the forbidden encounter. I knew that night would change everything, but I wasn't yet ready to face the consequences. For now, all that mattered was that for a moment, I felt alive in a way I had never felt before. That night seemed different from the moment I left the house. Something in the air, in the stars, in the full moon. The office was empty and gloomy when I arrived, a silence that seemed to pulse with the promise of what was to come. My heart beat fast as I walked down the corridor, feeling every step echo off the walls. When I opened the door to the living room, the sight of Ethan brought me to a sudden halt. He was standing there, half naked, with a provocative smile. The soft light from the lamp illuminated his defined muscles, and I could see the desire in his eyes. "I've been waiting for you," he said, in that husky voice that always sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't help but smile nervously, despite all the fear and guilt that consumed me. "I didn't think you'd be here so soon," I replied, trying to control my rapid breathing. The excitement and adrenaline were mixing in a way that made me dizzy. Ethan stepped forward, reducing the distance between us. "I couldn't wait," he murmured, running his fingers up my arm to my shoulder. His touch was like fire, burning the skin and igniting every nerve. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening interrupted the moment. My body froze, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Ethan, who also seemed surprised, but no less determined. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to stay calm. The figure at the door stepped forward, and my heart almost stopped when I recognized who it was. It wasn't Michael, as I had feared for a second. It was just a security guard doing his rounds. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, realizing the awkward situation. "I didn't know anyone was still here. I'll close the door." Before I could reply, he had already left, closing the door behind him. I let out a sigh of relief, even though I was still shaking. Ethan laughed softly. "I think we got lucky this time," he said, pulling me closer. "But that just makes it all the more exciting, don't you think?" I shook my head, trying to dispel the fear that still pulsed inside me. "Yes, but we need to be more careful. We can't risk ourselves like this." Ethan caressed my face, his eyes intense and full of desire. "I know, but I can't resist you," he whispered, before kissing me with a passion that made all my fears disappear, at least for a moment. That night was a mixture of sensations. The excitement of being with Ethan, the guilt of betraying Michael, the fear of being found out. Everything mixed together in a whirlwind that left me on the edge of the abyss. And yet I couldn't stop. Every moment with Ethan was a flame that burned stronger and brighter, consuming everything in its path. When we finally parted, it was already dawn. Ethan looked at me, his eyes still full of desire, and something else, something I couldn't decipher. "I have to go," he said, getting dressed quickly. "But this isn't the end, right?" I shook my head, feeling a twinge of sadness mixed with relief. "No, it's not the end," I replied, although I wasn't sure what would come next. "But we need to be more careful." He smiled, that smile that always disarmed me. "Always," he promised, before walking out the door, leaving me alone in the empty office. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. The risk, the passion, the guilt. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Something in Ethan was pulling me towards him, something I couldn't explain. When I finally left the office, the city was starting to wake up. The lights on the buildings were coming on, and traffic was starting to flow on the streets. I walked to my car, feeling the weight of everything I had done. But I also felt something else, something that left me confused and scared. As I drove home, one question kept hammering at the back of my mind. How long could I keep up this charade? I knew I was playing the odds, and that one day it could all fall apart. But for now, all I could think about was Ethan and the next meeting, the next kiss, the next touch. I got home and found Michael asleep in our bedroom. I looked at him, feeling a pang of guilt. He didn't deserve that. But now I was caught in a web of lies and desires that I couldn't undo. I lay down next to him, trying to calm my mind. But the thoughts kept swirling like a whirlpool. I knew that, eventually, I would have to make a choice. But for now, all I could think about was the next time I would see Ethan, the next time I would feel his touch, his kiss. And so, between guilt and excitement, I fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more risks, more moments that could change everything.